Welcome, everyone. We are here with David Ewing Duncan, who I had a chance to meet, I think about 15 years ago, I'm guessing. It was either through TED, the Singularity University, or maybe UC Berkeley, or maybe all three. I know. Or somewhere along the way. Anyway, we're honored to have you here today. And for those who are new to your work, I'm going to read a little bit about your background. David's an award-winning journalist, the best-selling author of 10 books published in 21 languages, and an entrepreneur. He's contributed to Fortune, Vanity Fair, Wired, MIT Tech Review, New York Times, and countless others, and also a former commentator for NPR's Morning Edition and special correspondent for ABC's Nightline. And then on the entrepreneur side, he's the founding director at the Center of Life Science Policy at UC Berkeley, on the faculty at Singularity University. Those were good days, by the way. And CEO of Arc Fusion, where they bring together science, health, technology innovators in a salon-like events in Boston and San Francisco, if I remember correctly, right? It was on both coasts.
Yeah, they're actually all over the world. We've had them, well, in Europe and North America and on the ocean.
Oh, wow. Okay. I missed those. I only went to the San Francisco ones, but they were amazing. So hopefully they will start happening again now that we're COVID clear, so to speak.
We're working on it.
His books are largely science-driven and include 164, Masterminds, Experimental Man, to name a few. But his most recent book, Talking to Robots, which we'll be talking about a little bit today, and other projects. And we'll also be talking about a recent experience that he's had with ketamine.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks for being here today. Super excited to see you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So I want to rewind a little bit. I mean, we started talking before we were recording today about Africa and our mutual love of Africa, and that I didn't even know that you had ventured across the continent so many years ago. You know, you've had your hands and voice in so many different avenues, right? Travel and culture and photography and whatever, but health and science have always been your main passion. Why? Like, what inspired you to take this path?
Well, actually, I spent the first part of my career, I would cover a topic for about 4 or 5 years, and then I'd get bored with it and shift to something else. So it did start out with a kind of adventure travel. I became a political reporter. I became a health policy reporter, but was still doing a lot of general things. And towards around 2000 or so, I was covering health care and health policy in Washington for ABC News and others. And I got tired of writing the same story over and over again, because healthcare was then and is still, there's just all these seemingly intractable problems about, how kind of honestly messed up our healthcare system is. So I sort of almost on a whim looked into some biotech and science. I said, this is really interesting what's going on, like with genetics and, all these other stem cells, all these different fields. And so I was asked to write a story for Wired magazine on the Human Genome Project, and which was just finishing at the time.
With Craig Venter. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Well, it was Craig. There were two teams that were in competition. There was a private team led by Craig Venter, and then a public team paid for by the U.S. Congress at the NIH. So, and there was a very famous sort of race competition between these two groups.
I remember that because he spoke on TED right after that.
Yeah. And so I was asked to write a story for Wired, and I looked into it. I didn't know that much about it. And I looked at the time, we didn't know that. I mean, there wasn't a 23andMe. There wasn't, no one was getting genetically tested. It cost millions of dollars to do any genetic testing, basically. And so I looked at it and said, why, this is kind of boring. It's like these 4 letters, A, G, T, and C, to just go on and on and on. And, their genes, and okay, some of that's interesting. So I approached one of the architects of the Human Genome Project, a guy named Charlie Cantor, who was at the NIH for a while and then at Berkeley and still around doing companies, and asked him, I don't know, it was a little crazy. I said, could I be tested? Could I have my, DNA tested? And, almost nobody had their DNA tested at this point. In fact, really nobody had. We found out later that Craig Venter actually used his own DNA for his human genome project, which he wasn't supposed to do, but we didn't know that yet. So I got Charlie and in a company that he had in San Diego to sequence me for, about several hundred genetic markers. And I wrote this up for Wired, and I found out a bunch of results, like, mostly stuff I didn't have. Like, I don't have the gene that gives you a high risk factor for Alzheimer's, for instance,
Wow, great.
which was known at the time. And yeah, some others, but I had a few things. But I was able to write about for the first time what it was like to get this information for a real human being. And we thought it was a gimmick at Wired. We almost didn't do it, but it became a huge story. And it got me going in the whole biotech era, or the whole, what was happening in biotech at the time. And so I launched a project called the Experimental Man Project. And that's what really got me into healthcare and biotech and technology, and later with the applications of like AI.
And you wrote a book about it with the same name. Yeah.
So I basically went out and got everybody who would test me to run whatever they were doing, and in healthcare tests. So molecular tests like DNA, but also metabolic testing, proteomic testing, and microbiome, all of that. I tested basically every wearable that was being made, back in the early days with Fitbits and things like that. I mean, you name it, I was tested on it.
And you had no fear for finding something out that you didn't want to know?
I was always asked that at the time. That's reminding me of that. A lot of people who I worked with said they would never do it. But I don't know. I've always been, I guess, a bit of a fatalist on this. I'm the type of person that if I was in a plane going down, I'd just kind of go, well, I guess my time is up. I'd probably be scared, don't get me wrong. But I was more curious about what I could find out with this new technology. And it was radically new. In fact, the Wired piece started with, I feel exposed, I feel naked, because that's how, new it was to find out this information that was hidden inside your body. But anyway, they got me off and running on healthcare and technology. And I really haven't stopped. I mean, it's still absolutely fascinating to me. And many of these technologies were not even close to being ready to tell you that much 20 years ago. But over time, they've slowly but surely gotten better and better over the years. And I think we're living actually in a moment right now where a lot of these technologies, the different omics, like genomics and the microbiome, are really poised to actually give us, useful information. And what I mean by that is you can get a kind of snapshot of what's going on inside your body right now, at any given moment. I mean, it's still very expensive to get a lot of these tests. It's not quite ready for prime time. But the idea is that you can get a picture of where you are right now. Hopefully you're healthy, when you're still healthy. But it can give you some predictions when you compare it to millions of other people who have gotten the tests and how disease plays out over time. You can get some risk factors and predictions on what your future healthcare might be. And more important, you might be able to do something about it, to prevent something.
I mean, I think that's the upside, right? You wrote that article on biobanks, right? And big data and the convergence of them. And, part of me was thinking, well, big data, it's great to have all this stuff, but it can be misinterpreted. The positive side to that is if there are positive things that you can do, like lifestyle changes, as our mutual friend Dean Ornish talks about all the time, right? That's reversing heart disease. But there's the other side to it, right? I was talking to Dr. Laura Esserman, who is doing new testing, right, around breast cancer.
Yeah.
Right. So we had a dialogue the other day, and there's this fear too, that if you find out too much, that you'll start living your life not in a positive way, right? That it's all over. So when you went through that, because I know you talked about that one of the stats that came up for you is that you got to see a cardiologist, you need to start taking statins. So how did you feel, right? Talk to people about your reaction to that, which is
well, there's an aspect of this you haven't mentioned, which is that when the information isn't really very good,
right,
or it's too early. And so that particular incident was a famous geneticist in Iceland named Kerry Stephenson. He started a company called Decode Genetics, which was one of the first major genetic kind of sequencing and analysis companies. We're talking 2000, early 2000s. And I went to Iceland and had him test me. And he literally called me when I was back home. Where was I living? I was living in San Francisco. He calls me back home and he goes, "Oh my God, I got your results back. You're really high risk for heart attack. You have to start taking statins immediately." And because he's basically a Viking, because he's Icelandic and he's descended from Eric the Red, he didn't just say that, he yelled it in the phone. I felt like I was getting like some Viking warrior, screaming at me and was about to attack. But anyway.
Well, that's what I was talking about. It sends you into a panic, and rather than empowering you, it deflates you.
Well, I knew enough about all of this by then. It actually didn't put me in a panic. A lot of people would be put in a panic, and it definitely concerned me because the gene it was 3 genetic markers that he had, his people had found. And it was a big story at the time. It was a front page story in the New York Times. I think that was the one. Anyway, a couple of them he did at the time. There's another one for stroke that I actually think was the one on the cover and the front page of the New York Times. But this was based on a theory at the time, or a sort of, I don't know, process of that ended up not actually being as real as people thought it was. It was the idea that there were single markers or single genes that govern something like heart disease. And heart disease is a common disease. There's so many variations of heart disease. I mean, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands of genes and markers and systems in your body that affect whether you're going to have a heart attack or not. So him calling me in with 1 or 2 markers and saying, "You're going to get a heart attack." I even knew at the time, okay, this can't really be right, and it wasn't. It turns out that in years after that, as they tested it on big populations of people, it wasn't as big a factor. I also didn't take statins though, because I had another gene that told me that I was high risk for a bad side effect on statins.
Wow.
So, but I don't know. I was always just I had more of curiosity. Like, why is that? What else can I learn? I mean, I was super healthy at the time, and I don't know. Nothing was telling me. I wasn't being convinced by much of this that like I had some dire thing that was going to happen, even though some people were telling me that.
Yeah. I mean, you also had luck on your side in the sense that you were much younger. So you didn't have that, that feeling that people get over 45, right? As they're approaching 50 and they're going through, I mean, it's not really our midlife crisis now seems to be 70, right? Because we're all living longer.
Well, I also, on the other hand, in that original story in Wired, I got some high risk markers for hypertension, for high blood pressure, which I now have. I mean, it's fairly mild still, but okay, that turned out to be true, even though the marker wasn't that good in terms of its statistical significance. And there's another one for hearing. I mean, I actually have, and I now know I have a genetic profile of mild hearing loss, and it's kind of annoying. I mean, it's not reached the point yet where I need to do much about it, but those 2 things were predicted, in 2001 when I had that testing done. So, it wasn't completely.
Yeah. And, I mean, what could you do about that? There's things you can do to reverse heart disease early on, right? Such as diet, lifestyle, and exercise and all of that. But, if it's hearing loss, that's genetic and probably not much you could do except for getting.
No, there's not much you can do to fix it. I mean, eventually I'll probably need to get some kind of hearing aid. And I am, in my experimental man mode, I am actually checking on, or I can kind of keep getting updates on some pretty far out companies that are working on new and better systems. I mean, hearing aids right now are pretty awful. They're basically just little amplifiers. And, you know, my particular hearing issue has to do with frequencies. And so I have a hard time hearing certain frequencies, whereas most frequencies I hear fine. And, you know, your hearing actually kind of works that way anyway. And when there are some corrections that can be made for severe hearing loss, like these implants I call cochlear implants, because the cochlear nerve is the audio, that's how you hear, your brain processes incoming sound. And those devices are pretty cool because they can take somebody who's totally deaf and plug in a little mini computer really into this nerve. It has, it's surgery, so you have to have an implant put in, and people can hear again. But
That's amazing. That's amazing.
It's programmed to hear a range of frequencies. And the early versions of the device, you could just hear a little bit, like maybe like a mid-range that we would normally hear. But now you can hear, I don't know what the number is, but dozens and dozens of frequencies, probably more than that. So people can actually hear music. They can hear the range of like an orchestra or something like that.
That's incredible, because it always makes me think of, I think of dolphins and dogs that have, can tap into these higher pitched frequencies. Yep. And also children, right? I mean, have a higher range of frequencies than we do as we get older. So I'm always curious about that, particularly, with people. Some people in the series we're talking to have the ability to tap into these other dimensions, right? And isn't that just tapping into another frequency in the universe that most human beings can't?
Well, I mean, there's not a lot of explanation from science right now on how that works, but you and I have talked before about I have a grounding in science, and I actually like to know how things work. But I have a very strong belief that things, they're more spiritual or harder to explain. Maybe someday we will get an explanation, and there's an awful lot we don't know. And if you're a good scientist, you have to acknowledge that. And, the whole idea of frequencies is such a great example. And, because we, for most of human history, we didn't know there were other sounds. We didn't know there were higher pitches or lower pitches. Or eyesight. I mean, we see a very narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum. It's like tiny, and the spectrum's like this big. But we didn't know that there was, more out there, like, I mean, everything from infrared to X-rays to, all these different frequencies. Those are light frequency, light wave frequencies, but we didn't know they existed until we had instruments that could measure it. So who's to say that we won't discover this, have those same sort of process with these, things that seem invisible out there, spiritual, that we'll understand those better. So I don't know. I mean,
aren't we just energy beings? Aren't we just photons?
Yes, we are. Yeah, we are. And there's so much. Well, DNA is a prime example. Aristotle writes about the idea that children have traits passed down from their parents, or other organisms. But he had no idea how. I mean, he actually thought the essence of like a tree was in the seed of the tree, like the whole tree, and it just grew out. He didn't realize that there was like code that was passed down that then grew out. But we didn't know what that substance was. It was passed down until fairly recently in history, about 100 years ago, or a little over 100 years ago. But so. I think there's all kinds of things that seem mysterious and magical, in one generation, and then a generation or two later, you figure out there is a scientific explanation. But I also don't like, sometimes when you say science, it's like the sense that everything's hard and fast and there's fixed rules. That's not true either.
No. Look at even the quantum physicists are arguing with each other over string theory and, everything. Yeah.
Well, like biology. COVID, we still don't know some basics about how that virus works. There was a lot of disagreement about that. one of the interesting things about learning, as I did as a journalist, hanging out with scientists and having them pull me aside. And I mean, I got tutored by some of the great scientists in the world who, I was asking kind of dumb questions, which was fine with them because they knew I wasn't a scientist. And literally they would pull out a whiteboard and just explain genetics to me.
Wow.
But, learning all of that, it gives you a sense, first of all, of how much we have learned about science, especially life sciences, but it also shows you how much we really don't know.
Yeah.
And it's a moving target. I mean, COVID, for those that were following it changed constantly. In fact, one of my big issues with the way it was handled, by the powers that be was something I call expertitis. And there are people, experts, PhDs, who are just used to having people come to them and want an answer, and their inclination is to give an answer. But often they should say, I don't know. And especially during the early days of the pandemic, the reality was that we just didn't know. All of science is like that.
Yeah.
There's very little that is just known definitively that will never change.
No, I'm glad that chapter's over, because it was, it was a good chapter and it wasn't a good chapter. I mean, the downside, of course, was the isolation and the people feeling isolated and lonely. And of course, the upside was that Gaia had time to regenerate herself, and suddenly the water was clear in Venice again, and other parts of the world, right? And we happened to see that. And we also got a really strong dose of the fact that, if you're white and you're privileged, right, this can happen to you. It doesn't just happen over there in the third world. So that was another positive thing. So there were a lot of positive things that came out of it, but this was a good segue, I think, into, your period of time through COVID where you got depressed, and you said that the pandemic brain fog snatched your ability to write, right? Which ultimately led you into experimenting with ketamine. So do you want to talk about your journey through that? Because that was fascinating. You had an article in that in Vanity Fair, right?
Yeah. No, the article was called Stolen Words, COVID, Ketamine, and Me.
Yeah.
And it really goes back to the very early days of the pandemic, in fact, February of 2020.
There it is.
Yeah, there we go. I still don't know if I really got COVID back then. My girlfriend at the time was pretty sick, thought with the flu. I got my usual little sniffles because I rarely get sick. We both had been to some events that later were known to kind of be places where COVID might have been lurking in New York. New York City was, the virus was everywhere in February. And it really started affecting, again, I don't want to go back and relive that again because it was pretty horrible. But I basically was fine with the initial symptoms. But 2 or 3 weeks later, I started having trouble breathing when I was exerting myself. And, I'm a big cyclist, and I'm very athletic, and it was just weird. And I didn't know, we couldn't test then. So I didn't really know if I had it or not.
Oh, you couldn't. Oh, that's right. Because that was,
if you remember, there weren't tests available.
No.
But at the time, we didn't know about long haul COVID. So I didn't know what was going on. I thought I was just freaking out like everybody else, anxious, all of that. And which is probably part of it, for sure. I mean, we were all terrified back then. Yeah. And so, I spent most of that rest of the spring and summer. I had a book to write, actually 2 books to write. I had things I needed to be doing, projects, and I was just really struggled mentally to be able to kind of bring back, just to do the things I normally did, to be able to put together, especially higher creative things. I could do the daily, emails and research and stuff like that. I even was able to put myself together to write some stories for Vanity Fair on COVID, short, quick kind of stories. Although my editor helped me a lot, some of it, but I just felt like I lost my words. And so that's what I write about. And they let me in Vanity Fair write it in a kind of style it's different than what I normally, usually pretty direct in my writing and science writing and stuff. This was a more hopefully kind of lyrical piece, if you will, because it really was about exploring what happens when you lose something that's really vital to you. I mean, this is like chopping off a leg or something, to not be able to do.
Well, do you think it was more less long haul COVID and more just depression from?
Well, that's what it ended up being. And I've never, I've had my moments in life, but I've never, had clinical depression, that kind of thing. But the brain fog and my inability to really be able to work at the level that I was used to working, and having trouble with projects I needed to get done, like this book that I was writing. I ran into a guy socially who actually is sort of the godfather of the ketamine movement, and he's a psychiatrist named Phil Wolfson, and he wrote the book The Ketamine Papers. He's in his 70s, although you wouldn't know it. He's still incredibly active, and he has a foundation. But he's one of the real active forces behind what they call ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, which is part of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So this is talk therapy where you go in, since ketamine only lasts about an hour, as opposed to others, LSD, psilocybin, they take hours. This is just an hour. You can actually go in and have an hour, with a psychoanalysis session, take the drug, you put your goggles on, you listen to music, you go through your journey, and then you can come out of it and then debrief. So, but he had to kind of talk me into it, because although I've always been around people doing psychedelics, I had never done them. Yeah. And I was always afraid. I mean, I'm a type of person who, I have an overactive imagination. I didn't want to mess with that.
That's how I feel. That's why I'm terrified.
Well, and I'm always trying to dial down my imagination, not amplify. Anyway, there are a bunch of reasons why I didn't do it. I didn't have it. I mean, like I said, I have a bunch of friends doing it. I had no problem with it. So he kind of talked me into doing it. I was reluctant, but he thought he could see that I was kind of struggling. Took me aside actually at this dinner out in this garden, because, this is when we were all outside. And he kind of said, I think you should come in and try this. And so I didn't really want to do it, but he gave me a really tiny, like, junior starter dose, and it was pleasant. And so then he had me come in and do a big dose and do the whole thing. And it was incredible. And I describe in some detail in the story what the journey was like, which was pretty crazy and wonderful.
So let's just back up for people who are new to the whole process. So the first dose was a mini dose, and it was oral, right? It was a tablet.
You take, yeah.
Right. And then you said the bigger dose was injected. So that's a big thing for people to know about.
But yeah, no, that is important. Although I don't know, those lozenges, they don't give you as strong an effect as the injection, especially, or as quick. I mean, injected, it's like 2 minutes. And
Wow.
Yeah.
So what happens in those 2 minutes? So describe the process for people.
Well, the lozenges take about 15 or 20 minutes. So you actually, it's sort of like a fizzy, one of those little, I don't know, Alka-Seltzer or something. Yeah. You put it under your tongue, it dissolves, and you sort of slosh it around in your mouth, and it actually enters your bloodstream through the capillaries in your cheeks and your gums. So it takes a little while to actually hit. But when you inject it directly, I don't know. I mean, he would inject me, and we'd have like about a minute or two where we, before it hit, and we would have a brief conversation. But I should really even back up, because I'm a huge believer in the idea of being intentional about psychedelics. And so it's not just a matter of just taking it.
I couldn't agree more, because, the truth is, it's on everyone's mind, right? It's gotten to a threshold where, it's being talked about in mainstream media now. And so people are curious. Everyone's curious.
But I was taking it partly because I was experiencing mild depression. And the exciting thing that's happening now in the whole field of psychotropics and in psychiatry is that for the first time in decades, we do have these new drugs, which aren't even new. They're actually been around a long time, some of them for thousands of years. And this is science now. This is where we get into the science. Science is telling us that ketamine, psilocybin, MDMA, they seem to work very effectively for some people, not everyone, to counteract depression and PTSD, and especially if you have like severe trauma, things like that. And not only does it work, it actually works almost instantly. Wow. And it's when I finished this first big trip, literally that night, I finished about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. By dinner time, my head had totally cleared. And I literally wept. Like I hadn't had my brain back for several months, and it was back.
Wow.
And I can tell you more about that because, the aftermath.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing.
But that's why I was taking it, and that's why Phil wanted me to take it. And there's, my piece in Vanity Fair has some of the science. It's not really a science piece, but there's a lot of places you can go to look that up, and it's actually quite exciting. And there's a lot of work being done because ketamine is a human-made substance like MDMA, which is ecstasy. There's a lot of engineering and designing going on now to actually modulate what you need. If you're depressed, you might take one version of it. If something else is going on. But I'm also a believer in just taking it if you're not depressed. I mean, it's as Phil says, Phil Wolfson, the psychiatrist, he's a big advocate of just, it's like he said, take a break from yourself, relax. It's you don't want to be taking this a lot. And there is some addiction that has happened with ketamine, but not as much as kind of the critics say, but it does happen. So you want to be a little careful.
So it is addictive. It can be addictive.
Well, it's not strongly addictive like, say, opioids. Okay. And there's a debate about that. But anyway, that's almost a whole nother. There are people who have addictive behaviors and, who get addicted to lots of different things. And it's sort of hard to disentangle that group from everybody else. But I mean, most of the evidence suggests that it's not highly addictive. Okay. But it is something to just think about. And people like Phil, are very careful about that.
So this might be a good segue into consciousness, because you were introduced to it through depression and your loss of words, but a lot of people are really interested in having these higher, or you could say deeper states of awareness, right? Where they're more connected to your higher self, the cosmic soup, universal consciousness, whatever you want to call it, right? Everyone's got, some people call it God, right? Some people call it G-O-D-D, God, G-O-D-D-E, God, right? The feminine face of God. But whatever that is for you, there's a curiosity now of reaching these other and deeper states of awareness. People are going on ayahuasca journeys. So it's kind of exploding. What do you think's going on? I mean, do you think the more natural way to get to the nirvana is meditation, right? Yeah. And there's, guided meditation, that type of thing. Yoga or just really stilling the mind and getting it into a theta or a theta wave state. And that gets you to reconnect to, I would call it, the internal compass, which is kind of what you had when you went through this. And you even said, the doctor said, take a break from yourself. So I thought that's interesting language because it's taking a break from your egoic self,
right?
And tapping into your higher self. So what do you think's going on?
Well, I think a lot of us, I think a lot of human beings are struggling right now. I mean, we had a mental health crisis before the pandemic. I've written some stuff about this and mindfulness. The mindfulness wave was becoming more and more popular, even at the corporate level, which I find fascinating, where large corporations were finding, that paying to have somebody come in and teach their executives meditation was actually helping, these executives not, go into crazy, anxious, panic attacks all the time. But I think modern life is, is something that our evolution has not really prepared us very well for. And by that, what I mean is, we were talking earlier about even living in cities which are all vertical and horizontal lines. Our brains didn't evolve to find comfort in vertical and horizontal lines. I mean, we evolved looking out over a savanna or tree lines or or hills. Those are the things that our brain settles on. As I don't know if it's comfort, but that's how we're trained. That's the patterns that our brains have evolved to be attracted to. And
it's not comfort, it's certainly serenity, right? And peace.
Well, I'm trying to describe it. This is sort of science in the sense that the brain works in patterns. I mean, it's why when you see a person that does has something really wrong with them, you can't help but stare at them, or you see something that you're used to seeing one way and it's an aberration, you stare, because the brain is literally trying to place it into a pattern that it understands. Yeah. And this is something that computers have a very hard time doing, because we work in pattern recognition. It's incredibly sophisticated. I mean, the brain, how it does it. But anyway, I think modern life, and especially in the US, our emphasis on individualism, we've moved ourselves away for some really important aspects of being human. And we've evolved to want to be around other people. And again, science supports this. I mean, being in groups of people with, families, with communities is so much more comforting to us. And so I think in the modern world, especially in the West, we've moved so far away from that. Yeah. I mean, it was kind of worth the experiment. I mean, we were actually living a pretty nice lifestyle with all this modern technology. I'm not opposed to that at all, but I think we need to start thinking about how to mitigate some of these aspects of modern life that are freaking us out.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, and this even goes down to the science, right, behind a baby who doesn't get touched by the mother or held enough. As physical beings, we're sentient beings, right? We need to be touched, we need to be held, we need to be, and I think, COVID showed us that, right? Where we didn't get that physical connection anymore. So there absolutely is science behind it. And, that reminds me, I didn't really want to go into robots, to be honest with you. When we first talked about doing this interview, I was like, oh,
but are we segueing from ketamine to robots?
And it's funny because I thought, oh, all the topics, because, remember how much time I spent there. I mean, it kind of brings me back to my tech life. I mean, after all, you may not even know this, but I launched the Willow Garage robotic program to solicit these brilliant ideas across industries. So I was involved in that. And of course, I launched Dragons Naturally Speaking and spent, more than a decade in AI. So, for me, I mean, they were exciting times. Don't get me wrong. I mean, who gets to dance with a robot and have a feeling that they're real? I really did. Actually, I started naming them and it kind of got crazy. But, I name everything. So it's just lately I've been moving away from the tech world, as John Holland likes to talk it, to go into the internal tech world, right? The internal compass. And so that's why I didn't want to go into robots. But then I started reading your book, which I don't have a hard copy of. So I printed, all 300 pages out. And I couldn't put it down. So it's a page turner,
I appreciate that. I mean,
yeah.
Well, one way to help connect all this, at least with the book, is the book is not about the technology. It's really about humans and human nature, and it's also stories. And one thing that, I mean, there are robots now that are able to write like basic, sports stories in newspapers. And there was actually even, I read that a painting or a visual image done by a robot actually won some contest somewhere.
Oh God!
The judges didn't know it was done by a robot, but they were kind of weirded out when they found out. So I mean, it's not that robots can't be programmed to exhibit or to mimic creativity. They're not actually being creative, but they're mimicking it. But that book is really about stories. And, some of the classic books about technology, like, like I, Robot by Asimov, that's really a series of short stories about humans who happen to have these machines. And most of the robots, and that was inspiration for my book, was really about, how is our future going to play out? That's what my book was about.
Yeah.
And what are the stories? And, how will these machines affect that? I mean, again, I don't have any problem with technology when we do it right and when it's useful. And, they're tools. And honestly, psychedelics are tools. I mean, so there is maybe some connection there. We are a species that we like to build things. And, oftentimes they're useful. Sometimes they're really, really not, like, say, nuclear bombs. But I mean, they can be deadly and really do us a lot of damage as well if we're not careful with it. But that's all in the realm of storytelling, which is, what we're talking about here.
Personally, it was both terrifying and funny at the same time. So I was finding myself oscillating back and forth between terrified and humorous. But I do have a question here, because you added this tense, this near future present tense. You said, which defines a tense that allows the reader to experience things that may occur in the future as if they're happening right now, or from the perspective of a person living in the future for whom the events of the present day happened long ago, but with the knowledge of how things actually turn out. What was your intention for adding that tense? Because I think it did a lot, right? Psychologically, as a reader, and I'm curious why you intentionally chose to do that.
Well, you kind of just gave the explanation when you read that. The idea I wanted. Well, I should probably pull back the book has got 24 chapters, and these are 24 kind of connected stories. So each of them is told by a narrator that's never identified, but who is living in the future. And this narrator is talking to us in the present about how things turn out for, say, a doctor bot, a sex bot, a journalism bot. There's even a God bot, which you can read about, but which is with Brian Greene, the physicist.
I love Brian Greene's work.
Yeah, and so each of these futures is different too, because as somebody I've been accused of being a futurist, and I say it in that way because nobody actually knows what the future is going to be. But I'm a historian actually by training, and you can see trends into the future from the past. So that's what this book is. It's taking trends that you could go back to, say, the 1920s, and we know what's happened since then. It's been almost 100 years. So that's what the book does. But each of these futures also is very different in the sense that sometimes they turn out well and sometimes they don't. Like Warrior Bot, we basically all die. I mean, survive. That's about autonomous warfare, and which is very scary. Others, it turns out okay.
What was it? I don't think it's called the job bot, but it's like the work bot, because that was hilarious.
No, that's the robot that stole my, goddamn job.
Yeah. That was hilarious. I mean, and terrifying also.
Well, and that's where everybody in the entire planet in the future loses their job to robots.
Yeah, to robots, right? Yeah. And they don't see it coming because they just can't imagine.
Yeah. That's not going to happen, but it's a thought experiment. Like, why don't we just take, because there are people, especially in Silicon Valley, but it's other places where their head is down and they're building these machines that are going to automate everything. And we're not really giving it a lot of thought. And that's mostly what the book is, a wake-up call.
Yeah.
It's like, what's actually, instead of just building everything in sight, just because we can, maybe some of them we shouldn't, or maybe, there should definitely be some controls to make sure that it doesn't hurt us, that they don't hurt us. I mean, we so often make things first and then figure out what's wrong with them later, and then we have to modulate. And, I use fire, the discovery of fire as a prime example. There was a point back in history when, our ancestors discovered fire, and I'm sure there was a pro-fire and an anti-fire group. The pro-fire, like, we can cook things, we can stay up at night. And the anti-fire is like, yeah, but it's going to kill us. It can burn down our houses. I mean, it's dangerous.
It's awareness. I mean, this goes back to, we need to be aware of what we're not aware of, you know,
Right.
and I certainly think the time meters on the phones to let you know how long that you've been spending is one way, you know, forward. But what else can we do? Because it is addictive, right? And, you know, there's tons of science that points to people spending more time on Facebook as being more depressed and less happy, less joy, less fulfilled than not. There's science to back this up.
Well, but see, that's a prime example of Facebook basically is designed to addict you to it. I mean, it's designed to keep you on there.
Yeah.
And, you know, the more time you spend on Facebook, the more time they have to get data from you to make money by selling your data to advertisers. I mean, that's their business model. Think about social media if it was designed to actually enhance, you know, humanity. And I'm working with a nonprofit right now called the Responsible Innovation Lab. That's some executives coming out of the big 5 tech companies. There are lots of other people working on this, but you know, it's about responsible innovation. And you have a choice when you design these things. You know, you can design them purely to make money, to addict people. You know, these other really, you know, less desirable factors, or you can design them to support people, to help people. I mean, when you see Twitter, when there's demonstrations, like, you know, as we're talking here, there's women demonstrating all over Iran, and the Iranian government keeps trying to subvert, to cut out the internet, but somehow they still get videos out. I mean, that's a, you know, incredible use of that technology.
Yeah, for sure.
To connect people who are, you know, trying to end oppression. So there are definitely, and you know, in the early days of Facebook, I think I was like everybody else. It was fun. Like, you know, people I hadn't seen in high school for years and years and years. Suddenly I'm, you know, interacting with them again. That part of it is not, in my view, it can be positive, actually.
Yeah, I agree.
But, you know, and this goes all the way down the line. And a lot of the robots that I write about, and you know, which are really topics of different types of robots, you know, like sex bots. I mean, I talked to several sex therapists, and they're including Esther Perel, who's a friend. And Esther got after me. She said, "You can't call this a sex bot." I mean, you know, because that's not really what people want. They want intimacy.
Yeah, they do.
And so I actually call it sex intimacy bot. And in, you know, in the future, everybody has an intimacy bot. And anyway, but you can see where that could go really badly. Like it could really cater to people's, you know, instincts that are not as positive about anything. But in the future, we all have these intimacy bots, but the intimacy bots, they're right there to help us with every situation we get in relationships or everything. And they're actually designed by people like Esther Perel. So they're not only pretty positive, but they also make you think about the messy things that might be happening, like in your love life or something like that.
So they don't replace your partners, because that was
no, not in this. So this future is turning out to be kind of interesting, right? It's not replacing your partners. It's more like a coach, like an Esther Perel. So I intentionally did that. Like, what if things go really right? Because, you know, we all would kind of like to have Esther Perel right there as a hologram that we could talk to it, and, you know, when we're having problems with our partner or whatever.
So think about a robot with an advanced AI mind that might or might not be conscious. And so when I was reading about that, it made me think of Julia Mossberg's work with Loving AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
So will robots be conscious? Can they be conscious? You said, you used the word mimic earlier. So can they become conscious?
Well, first of all, we're not even really sure what human consciousness is. I mean, is it just we're just extremely highly evolved to respond to things, and it seems like we're conscious in making decisions, or are these just things, you know, are we just following a really sophisticated version of instinct? But right now, I mean, there are a lot of people trying to build brains, artificial brains, robot brains, AI brains that do what humans do. But I use the word mimic because right now, the robots that we've designed, you can program them to look a lot like humans doing things, but there's not a single robot that has what's called general intelligence. I mean, you know about artificial intelligence, so which I don't really like because it's not really an artificial and it's not really intelligent. But we can design computers to play chess, for instance, and they can beat even the best human chess players.
Yeah, it's amazing.
But it's based on a set of rules that you can teach the robot, and you can just teach it to think ahead, faster than a human. So we already know robots can do things like that. They can do calculations. They can amass data and do certain functions much better and faster than we can do. But you change one rule in the chessboard, like, a knight, instead of going 3 forward, goes 4 forward, and then over 1. Okay, you'd have to completely reprogram the computer, where if you told a human chess player, we're going to change that rule, it might take a little adjustment, but they're going to be able to probably integrate that pretty quickly. But even more important, that human is also thinking about all kinds of things, like, maybe that night they have to have a difficult conversation with their partner, or, the weather, the room's a little warm, or, what are those people over there talking about that are whispering, or, in other words, we have all kinds of things going on.
Yeah, at the same time.
In our conscious minds, and also in our unconscious minds. Whereas a robot's got one thing that's been programmed to do. Mm-hmm. And another example of that, which is kind of frightening, is, I don't know if you remember the 737 MAX 8, Boeing jet that crashed. This is, 4 or 5 years ago. This brand new plane, one of the most sophisticated robots that's ever been made by humans, if you want to think of it that way.
I remember that.
It could fly itself. It could, and all its systems were basically automated. The pilots were almost there for decoration in some ways. And there was one data input that was a monitor on the outside of the plane that was measuring, where it was in 3D space. And it was giving false sensory readings, and it was telling the plane that it was in a nosedive, stalling, when in fact it wasn't. And no matter, the pilots tried to override it. There was nothing. That's
what I was going to ask, because there were pilots there too. They couldn't override it.
Why? They couldn't. I mean, they knew immediately what had happened. Because the plane wasn't stalling. It was. In fact, the adjustment that the computer was making a crash. It was forcing it down, and they couldn't override that. So that's an example of the most.
So why couldn't they override it though?
Well, because that's partly the arrogance of people who design these computers and these robots. It never occurred to them to not design it that way.
So you bring that up in your robot book with the jobs, right? That, suddenly they're being escorted out by the robots, they're losing their jobs, and they couldn't override that.
Yeah.
So that's a perfect
when you ask about consciousness, a conscious human can make those determinations. And, humans don't always do the right things either, but we have a better sense of kind of what's going on in the big picture, and we can adjust like that. And that is called general intelligence. At the moment, I don't know, there are a number of examples I can give, but the other one is what's called the cat example. If you ask a computer, that has, kind of a lens to be able to see things, if you showed a cat or a picture of a cat, can it identify it as a cat? Mm-hmm. Okay, it turns out for a computer to be able to identify a picture of a cat or a real cat, you need to program literally millions of pictures of cats, every cat you could possibly imagine. it can only identify that cat if it's got one of those images matches the real cat.
Identically?
Well, pretty close. I mean, there's certain parameters, but not long ago, if you showed a computer a cat and it wasn't in their programmed images of cats, it might mistake it for a baby, or it might mistake it for some other animal, or it might not be able to identify it at all. And that was called the cat problem.
So let's go back to the idea of consciousness, though. I want to make sure that we do touch on this. So we now know that consciousness exists outside of the brain. If it exists outside of the brain and we're energy beings and energy sentient beings, that we're tapping into that consciousness, and it exists long after the body dies, what's to say that an object like a robot couldn't tap into that consciousness after it becomes more evolved? I mean, right now it's not evolved.
Well, I mean, it could happen at some point. I'm not really exactly sure what consciousness is even for humans. Is there a universal consciousness? Probably, but I'm not sure that we're seeing anything but a tiny fraction of it if it exists.
Yeah.
And so these are questions that we can't even really define without robots. But to make it simple, I think there's not any particular reason to have design a sentient robot. I mean, mostly in the real world, we're using these things for specific tasks.
Yeah.
And we have all this sci-fi around, science fiction around, like Data and the Enterprise and Star Trek, where you have androids and sentient robots. And I think that's humanizing these machines almost to a ridiculous level at this point anyway. And the question is, do we even, I mean, I know most serious engineers are not working on that.
Most of the engineers working on this are men, not women too. So
yeah, no, that's true.
Just throw that in there
which is a whole nother issue, but and then most of them are there are a lot of ethnicities that are not represented in who's designing these. So that's another question. If you did create a sentient robot, it would probably, would it be a white supremacist?
Right.
robot? Since a consciousness. I mean, there's so much bias built in. Things like facial recognition still, I'm a white man, and like the white men who design these things, are mostly men design them. So I don't have a big problem with facial recognition, but women, especially people of color, there's, in other words, there's a ton of biases being built in. And another way to answer the consciousness and sentient question is around whose consciousness and who's sentience.
Yeah, it's a great question.
The whole question of human nature. What my book is really about, because remember, I've trained as a historian. A lot of what you do as a historian is study how human nature, can be great and noble and do amazing things and create beautiful things, and how it can really suck. We're seeing that playing out right now in Ukraine and places like that. There's an aspect of human nature that really is disastrous, and it's evil, and it destroys things. And so, do we want all of that on our robots? Do we want that range? That's how we've evolved. But when as we're sort of blithely moving along and designing and talking about building human-like robots, what do we mean?
No. I think that that's a really valid point. I do feel like our collective consciousness is getting kinder than it was 100, 200, 300 years ago. Even though if we look at Afghanistan and we look at the Ukraine and we look at, Iran, maybe, it doesn't feel like it, right? From our vantage point, because we're getting hit with this stuff in the media all the time. But if you look back, to the Roman times, right, where it was just fun, it was just fun to kill people. It was no big deal. There was no respect for human life. So we have evolved. And if that consciousness has evolved, I think things like your responsible technology project, I like to call it conscious tech, right? Where we're having a consciousness and intention towards creating tech and design and medicine and everything, right? That we're creating as human beings with a consciousness of humanity for the good of all.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And I mean, Steven Pinker's Our Better Angels, that no question that we are living better and more secure lives, now in general than we were 150 years ago, and before. I mean, I have to hasten to say that's not everyone lives that way, and there's still a lot of people living in poverty and hunger, but it's far fewer numbers of people and percentages of people than in the past.
Pinker's book was hopeful.
Yeah. But on the other hand, we still seem to be able to produce, among our human gene pool, the Vladimir Putins of the world, and others. I mean, authoritarianism seems to be coming back, and
even in the West.
or like a Hitler or some, or Stalin. I mean, even in this modern era where arguably more people are doing better than ever in the past, you still have, I mean, Ukrainians until the invasion in February were living kind of like we live, and then suddenly they weren't because of really just one guy.
Yeah, no, I know it's valid. We have to respect our democracy, right? We can't take it for granted.
Well, I'm talking more about human nature. Like one guy who managed to kind of take over a country, and obviously had a lot of help, and there are a lot of people that benefited personally in a kind of greedy way. The kleptocrats and others in Russia, they created a milieu that allowed this kind of, I would say, pretty evil guy to, rain down death and destruction on another country for no other reason than his own ego. I mean, so in other words, it still happens, even though I totally agree with you that in general, there's not the death and destruction and insecurity that there has been in most of human history for most people.
Yeah. So to end, I'd love to just bring in where you think spirituality is heading. I mean, obviously there's a retreat from traditional churches and synagogues and structures, right? Traditional religion across the board around the world. We're seeing that. And we are seeing collective consciousness getting kinder, even though there's, a lot of crap in the world that's depressing. But where you had said earlier, spirituality and science are not incompatible.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that? And where is it going for people who are no longer looking to the Allah or the God in the sky, right? They're looking sort of more within, right? Mindfulness and.
Well, yeah, within, I think part of the psychedelic movement, especially with plants like psilocybin, I think we were intended to actually take these plants.
I do too.
We have a symbiotic relationship with plants in general. We eat them, I mean, they actually talk to us through bacteria and, other ways. I mean, we have an interaction with them we're not even really aware of. And so, when I did my journeys, I was absolutely fascinated with why was my brain taking this substance and then seeing hallucinations of all kinds of crazy stuff. And one explanation is that we're actually supposed to be taking, not all the time or anything like that, but, as we know, most indigenous cultures have a plant. The Greeks did, the Romans did, certainly indigenous cultures in the Americas, even in Europe, they all had substances that they took mostly for religious, spiritual reasons that helped them tap into something that was really important. And it may have been some of the science showing the rewiring of the brain that actually kept them sane. This whole, sudden discovery that it helps with, these things help with depression and all of that would not be news to our ancestors. who took these things.
Yeah, you're probably right.
The terminology that we didn't have the terminology like depression. But in other words, I think we're having a kind of rediscovery of things that tie us back in to a more connected and spiritual, a connectedness with with nature, with each other. And like I said, I think we tried this experiment. It's from a lifestyle standpoint, a lot of metrics say we're living better. I mean, we have nice a lot of people, have, well, at least houses. They're not struggling to find shelter and food and all of that. I mean, most people.
Yeah.
Make sure that I'm not saying that everyone does, but there's been a huge trade-off for that. I mean, we've forgotten some of our basic roots and things that are important, and possibly how our ancestors got by, given that their lives were much more of a struggle. And as organized religion has faded for a lot of people, I think part of like my going to my psychiatrist, I didn't tell you the whole thing. I mean, we had a session, like a psychoanalytical session, but he surprised the hell out of me as I was going under. I got the injection, the ketamine was starting, and I got my mask on, and he starts doing this ritual because he's a Buddhist. And he had a symbol, and he's hitting the symbol, and he's chanting what we just talked about in the session, the things that I'm intentionally wanting to kind of have part of my journey. And it was so incredible. I felt really connected to something bigger than me. And I think we need ritual. Ritual at its best, it's not the bad part of ritual where you're locked into something and you're being oppressed.
Yeah.
These are rituals that help us get through the day. I mean, I wake up every morning now and read poetry and meditate, and I used to get up, listen to the news, read the paper, and jump right into work. And that was agitating.
Yeah. It's not the way to start your day, right?
No. But
you want to recenter yourself. Yeah,
but your question about, I think that I have an open mind about where science and spirituality come together. And, unfortunately, the two camps tend to be pretty separate. And you have extremists on both sides.
Yeah, you do have extremists.
I don't really like to talk to the other. Yeah, and especially on the science camp, to be honest with you, because everything has to have an explanation. But I think that we are already, like I was saying earlier, we've already have scientific explanations for so many things we didn't understand, earlier in the history of humanity. And I think we'll continue to have that progression. And, not that we even need it in particular. I mean, spirituality is partly about getting in touch with yourself, and we don't need to have a lot of science to explain that. We know that works, and it's important, and it's helpful. But I think we probably, for those of us that care, we'll more and more figure that out and find explanations. And it'll be great. It'll be satisfying to me anyway.
Well, and perhaps, and I'll end with this, perhaps on your journey, on your medicine journey, right, your ketamine journey, perhaps you were actually accessing, as Herbie Hancock says, the universe. After all, certainly the universe. I know. I mean, if we are the universe, then, in quantum physics, we are the hair on the head, but we're also all the hairs on the head. We're the whole, and we're just one little piece of it. And so if that's true, we are the universe.
Well, I think everything is integrated, and, everything's connected. And just to give us small plug for my book I just finished, the microbiome, it's on the microbiome of the planet. This is bacteria, even viruses. It's everything. It's this invisible world. And there are more microbes than there are stars in the universe. There are more microbes on Earth. And the reason I'm bringing this up in the context of what we were just talking about, the book is about connectedness. And the planet is literally intricately connected. This is life on Earth is so closely integrated that it's like a giant spirit, if you want to think of it that way. It's certainly like a giant organism. But, and again, we don't consciously know this is happening, but that could be one explanation for what, this great spirit is on the planet. We just are so
Yeah.
intimately connected, literally, and science can partly at least give us some indicators on how that works.
So less in the Borg kind of way and more in like the redwood trees under the ground kind of way.
Well, you saw Avatar, right? The movie?
Of course, many times.
Remember the blue glowy thing that connects everything on the planet, on Pandora? Yeah. Okay, that's Hollywood, but there's a version of that really exists on Earth, and it's through microbes. I mean, it doesn't glow blue and you can't see it, but we literally are being, everything that's happening to us right now is being modulated by these invisible creatures.
By the way, James Cameron is not in this series that we're doing, but one of his film guys is Simcha. He's actually in episode 1. And Simcha actually explained that. He said that James Cameron did so much research. I mean, it was real research based on real biology. That's what he said. And so it does actually mimic what's happening in the real world, apparently.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what the book is about.
Great.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. This has been an incredible conversation. We went in directions that I had no idea we were going to go in.
This is really wonderful. I appreciate that.
Thanks so much, David.